Hello there. Okay, in the last notes on your brain, we talked about the hindbrain and then the limbic system and the midbrain. And now our next part of our notes, we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is considered the most complex. It is what makes humans so much different than all other living things, is because we have this higher order process in the cerebral cortex. Okay, so you'll need to know the different parts of the cerebral cortex, where they are, and then what they do. So let's talk about the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, made of the cerebral cortex, is this outside of the brain here. So in our last notes, we talked about the brain stem here, the cerebellum, the small brain, our limbic system here in the middle with the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. And now we're moving to these outer portions, all right? So the last part to develop. So think about it developing from up, 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 and then our last part. And really these parts of our brain are developing all throughout your childhood, your teenage years, and then the last part, you've probably heard this before, is the last part to develop is that frontal, the cerebral cortex in the front, and this is the part with like decision making and critical thinking. So these parts are still being rewired and developed very late into life. Okay, and by late I mean like into like early 20s. All right, so the cerebral cortex is a very intricate fabric of interconnected neural cells, and it covers the entire hemisphere. So remember, we talked about we have our right and our left hemisphere, so it's covering both. And it's the body's ultimate control and information processing center. Again, what really sets us apart from any other animal that we know. So let's talk about the different parts of the cortex, because they're all in charge of very different things. So glial cells are a very special type of cell in the cortex that support, nourish, and protect neurons. They're called glial because it means glue, so they're putting things together. These are only found in our nervous system, and they make sure that these cells are nourished, so kept alive, and then protected. All right, so glial is the cells that kind of protect and support in our nervous system. Okay, so here are the cortex lobes. I think these are somewhat easy to remember where they're at, and a little bit harder to remember what they do. But we're going to, again, focus on that kind of thing in class. For now, I just want to get this information done. Okay, so the first lobe, so you can look at this guy's, he's looking from the side right here, so we're just looking at half of the brain. So the first part is the frontal. Okay, that's pretty easy. It's in the front. Remember, we have a right and a left side to all of these lobes. But here's my frontal. I think the other one that's easy to remember is my temporal lobes, because that's on the side. If you remember, like, here's your temples. The temporal lobes are located on the side with our ears. The parietal lobe is in the upper top of your head. And the occipital lobe is this, like, bump right here on the back of your head back here. Now the occipital lobe is a little different because the occipital has to do with vision. You would think that it'd be near your eyes, but it's actually on the back of your head. And we'll talk about vision with the split brain. But those are the different types of lobes. Again, you need to know the four, what they do, and then always keep in mind that there's a right and a left lobe. All right, so there's a right frontal lobe and a left frontal lobe. Same thing with the parietal, temporal, and occipital. All right. So my motor cortex, so now look here, so now I'm looking at the brain a little bit more 3D. So this is all my cortex, but my motor cortex is at the rear of my frontal lobes. So my frontal lobes, it almost is kind of like a headband that goes across in between the frontal and the parietal, or I'm sorry, the temporal lobes here, and then the parietal lobes here. So it's like this headband that goes right through here. Now my motor cortex at the back of my frontal lobes, this controls all voluntary movement. Remember, we talked about reflexes are part of my brain stem. So coughing, sneezing, swallowing, those are things that are outside of my control, or those are reflexes. This is talking about voluntary. I want to take my hand and point to my motor cortex. That's a voluntary movement that my motor cortex is control of. Okay, these are some really neat images that talk about your, so it's looking at what part of the brain. So look what it did here. It took this slice of my motor cortex for output. And so this is my purple here, and it kind of mapped out. So here are my toes, those are towards the front, my knee, my hip, my trunk, arm, and then your face is all kind of right here, and then your tongue and your swallowing, remember, goes back a little bit into here. Okay, so we're going to talk about two things with motor output, the the motor cortex, your sensory and then your output. So here's my sensory cortex. It's just behind my, my motor. So my sensory cortex, this is from my left hemisphere. This is what receives input from the opposite side of the brain. All right, so if we're talking about moving my right hand here, my left part of my motor cortex is in charge of that. Okay, if I'm talking about moving my left hand, my right side is in charge of that. Okay, so when I sense things on my right side, it moves up and it goes to my left side of my motor cortex. I'm sorry, sensory cortex. I keep saying motor there. So it goes to my sensory cortex. And then the motor cortex, I'll go back to here, is responsible for once I sense something that going back and telling me to move. All right, so my sensory here is my left hemisphere receives from my right side, and then my left hemisphere section controls my right side of my body. So going back to our example of feeling a flame. So I sense things with my right hand. So I sense something hot that goes up, crosses over to my left part of my motor cortex, and then my sensory cortex, and then my motor cortex sends back the information to move something away. Okay? Remember, this is not the simple reflex. The simple reflex is only part of our the inner neurons in our spinal cord. So this is a more complex reflex. All right. This one's a kind of an interesting diagram here for sensation. So sensation is talking about body proportion. If my brain, so back here, so if my sensory part of my brain actually was in proportion to my body, here's what it would look like. And this is kind of neat. But what it's basically showing you is that you have a lot more sensory nerves and part of your cortex dedicated to the parts of your body that get a lot of sensory input. So our hands make up a huge portion of our sensory cortex. Our lips, our tongue, our face, a huge part of our sensory cortex. There's more neurons dedicated to these parts of our body because they sense more important things. Think about things that touch your lips, things that touch your mouth. You need to have more sensation in these parts of your body because they're responsible for more, taking more information in. Versus like your legs, the back of your legs have very little sensory input. Your back has very little sensory input. All right, so those two parts of our cortex right next to each other at the back, remember, of our frontal lobe. Okay. So here is a picture of the different types of cortex we have. Our motor cortex we just talked about on our frontal lobe, voluntary. The somatosensory is the part that is right behind the motor cortex. That's actually on our parietal lobe. So we talked about that headband that goes across between the frontal and the parietal. So the motor cortex in the frontal, the sensory is right in the parietal, and this is from our body sensation. And now we'll talk about these other three. The auditory or hearing, this is located near my on my temporal lobes here. This is responsible for anything what you're hearing right now. And then your visual cortex is on your occipital lobe in the back, and that's for vision. So right now you're using these two, right, because you're listening and you're hearing, and then your motor cortex, you're writing things down as I'm talking very quickly. And then you have these things called the association areas, and these are on all four lobes. These are important to know because you need to have some type of communication between the four parts of your brain. You're hearing things, you're writing things, you're seeing things. Your association areas are the ones that are involved for combining all of this information to make everything make sense and to coordinate. I'm hearing this, and now I'm going to write it down, and then I'm going to pause, and I'm going to look. Your association areas on all four, you can see where they're somewhat located, are responsible for making all of these things make sense within your brain. So we've actually had some really cool information come from this guy named Phineas Gage, and we'll look at an article in your book on him. But Phineas Gage was a worker who worked on the railroads, and there was an accident. What happened was he actually had a metal rod shoot up through his head and remove parts of his brain, and he did not die, right? So it went in through his occipital lobe and shot out of his brain. It removed like part of his skull here and then part of his eye. And he actually had, we learned a lot about the association areas because of him. He had parts of him removed. And his frontal lobe, part of his frontal lobe was removed. And that told us a lot about how he became very emotional, and he had some really interesting things happen to him. But he also part of these association areas with his parietal lobe and his temporal lobe. So we'll talk about Phineas Gage in class probably tomorrow. Okay, so let's look at language. So let's put all these type of things together. So language is something oh my gosh, I see this on tests all the time. You need to know these 3 areas. But language is something that's complicated, right? Because when you're hearing, looking, saying words, you're actually putting all different parts of your cortex together. So you'll need to know these 3 different things: aphasia, Broca's area, and Wernicke's area. So here's some really interesting parts of our brain so you can see where they're located. So aphasia is when you have impairment of language, usually caused by left hemisphere damage to either Broca's or Wernicke's area. All right, so Broca and Wernicke were 2 different researchers that found these parts of the brain. So you can see, so when we're looking at language, you need to hear, and using your auditory cortex, and we'll talk about Wernicke's area. Seeing words, that's going to be using our visual cortex and the angular gyrus. And then speaking is having to do with Broca. So language is in different parts of our brain, but you do need to know that it's mainly located in the left, all right? So language left, remember that. So language is mostly in our left hemisphere. So if I'm having difficulty speaking words, I can see them, I can hear them, but I cannot say them back, then this is something's wrong with Broca's area. So you can think that broken speech, Broca's area. I cannot talk, all right? Versus Wernicke's area is over here. Wernicke's disrupts understanding of language. So I can talk it, but for some reason, I can talk it. I can speak it, but I can't understand what's going on with language coming into my senses. All right, and aphasia is when there's something wrong with language due to one of these 2 things. So let's look at language in the different parts of the brain. So again, you have all different parts here represented. I have my occipital lobe, I've got my frontal lobe, I've got my parietal lobe, and I have my my temporal lobe here. So language. Okay, so my visual. So right now you're looking at things on your screen. So my visual cortex is responsible for receiving those written words. So I see them as visual. That goes to my angular gyrus, which transforms visual into some type of auditory code. So even if you weren't saying the word out loud, if you looked at this for just a second in silence, your brain is saying language. You can actually make an auditory code from that, or when you read to yourself, you can still, it's almost like you're talking silently to yourself. That's in the angular gyrus. It then goes to Wernicke's area, which interprets auditory code. So if you're hearing it, Wernicke's area is responsible for interpreting that auditory code, which then goes to Broca if you want to say it back. So now I saw it, all right, I transformed it into some type of visual for auditory code. I can hear it, and now I want to say it. So Broca's area controls speech because it goes to my muscle cortex, and then I can say it. All right, so I look at language, my brain translates that into that, says language. Wernicke's area helps me hear or understand it. Broca's area helps me say it, and then my motor cortex actually moves my mouth and my vocal cords and my breathing out to say the word language. The last part of our notes we're going to talk about is something called plasticity. So your brain, even though we talked about is developing later into life, sometimes even to your 20s, there's a lot of information a lot of information gained on your brain's plasticity. And plasticity does not have to do with brain damage that happens late in life, but brain malfunctions that happen very early in life. So plasticity has to do with when parts of your brain are damaged earlier in life. You'll actually have parts of your brain that grow into those damaged parts. So for instance, if you are born without vision, if you have parts of your visual cortex that aren't working, so if you're born blind, you actually have your other senses grow into that part of your cortex. So you might have a better sense of smell, a better sense of touch, and it actually grows into the part of the visual cortex that was supposed to be for vision but is somehow damaged. Okay, this is called neurogenesis. It's your body's way of creating new neurons, or making genesis, new neurons when others are damaged. Now, your brain cannot do this later into life. So people that lose their vision later in life, other parts or senses do not grow into that area. But this happens. We do a lot of research with brain plasticity in children, and looking at what happens when part of the brain is removed as a child and the other parts that grow into it.